The White House says it's on track to pull out of Afghanistan by the end of the month, despite international pressure. With days to go to get out, heavy crowds remain around Kabul airport, with people tense and emotional.
One day you will come back to Afghanistan.
Never. Never. It's not my country. After this, it's not my country.
Appeals at the G7 virtual summit to the US to extend its August the 31st deadline. But the White House warned of threats from the local Islamic State group.
With each day of operations on the ground, we have added risk to our troops with increasing threats from ISIS-K, and that completion of the mission by August 31st depends on continued coordination with the Taliban.
For Afghans still seeking to flee, the Taliban appeared to harden their message, saying that only foreigners can be evacuated. Also tonight, as Scotland records its highest ever figure of daily COVID cases, people are warned that restrictions could be reintroduced. McDonald's runs out of milkshakes and some bottled drinks at restaurants across Britain. And the Rolling Stones drummer Charlie Watts has died at the age of 80.
And coming up in the sport on the BBC News channel, there's a Carabao Cup Panenka for Aston Villa in their clash with Barrow. We'll bring you all the news from the 22 ties on Tuesday.
Good evening. The White House has reiterated that the US is on track to pull out of Afghanistan by August the 31st, citing security concerns if it stays. President Biden is due to speak this evening. It comes after a virtual summit of G7 leaders, during which the US was put under pressure to extend the deadline. Boris Johnson called on the Taliban to allow safe passage beyond that date for anyone who wants to leave. But in a hardening of tone, the Taliban today indicated they would not allow Afghans to be evacuated, and the US should stop encouraging them to go to the airport to be flown out. We'll have more from the US in just a moment, but first our chief international correspondent Lise Doucet reports from Kabul and the situation at the airport.
Stay calm, orders this Taliban guard. There's no calm here, not in a crowd too big to count, too big to control. But the days are numbered now before the US pulls its soldiers from this airfield, before their last evacuation flight lifts off. Panic is rising. Most Afghans have waited here for days, including 4-year-old twins Usna and Usnia. Their father was a guard for the US military. They've got documents to prove it. It's been such a bad experience, their mother Amina says. So bad. My children have been so scared. We're meant to leave.
Know me now who I am. They didn't know me.
You can feel the fear. It's not just the kids. Wahidi Faizi, an Afghan journalist, believes she's not safe under Taliban rule.
They know I'm a journalist. If they know, I know they will kill me.
One day you will come back to Afghanistan.
Never. Never. It's not my country. After this, it's not my country.
These are the moments, these are the last moments for Afghans who feel not only are they leaving their country, they're losing it, leaving everything behind. This is a journey like no other, the most important journey they're probably going to make in their lives. And it's a journey so fraught with risk and fear. Wahidi Faizi, in her red headscarf, keeps pushing forward. On this side, British soldiers glance at papers. They stand guard, doing what they can to contain the chaos, along with US troops.
These Americans are inexperienced. They ask the people to come in a very short time. They make this rush of people. This is the mismanagement of the Americans and nothing else.
And at a Taliban news conference today, an even starker message.
My message to the Americans is that they should evacuate all their citizens by the deadline of August the 31st. They have the resources, they have planes, they have the airport. They should evacuate all their forces and their contractors and those belonging to them. We will no longer allow them to evacuate Afghans.
In the centre of the city, behind another gate, another place of hardship and heartache, families displaced by fighting. They're on the move too. Now that the Taliban have taken control, they're boarding buses to take them back to Kunduz in the north. Sattar was injured in a gunfight there.
Yes, I want to go back home. We don't even have food here, and I haven't been able to get treatment for my arm.
A nation wounded by war, a people pushed from their homes. Afghanistan's long conflict turns another corner. No one's sure yet where it will lead. Lise Doucette, BBC News, Kabul.
Well, at the G7 meeting this afternoon, the US faced calls from European leaders to maintain troops in Afghanistan. The EU Council President said Kabul airport should stay open for as long as it takes to evacuate those trying to leave. And the German Chancellor Angela Merkel said that airlifts could not continue without the US. Our Deputy Political Editor Vicky Young has more.
This is an emergency international effort, tens of thousands being taken to safety, but many won't make it out.
Mr Johnson, has America let us down?
The British government and others have pleaded for more time, but that's been rejected by the Taliban and the American president. Leaders from the world's richest nations had a lot to talk about. 20 years of military action in Afghanistan are ending in chaos, but Boris Johnson is keen to gloss over diplomatic differences.
We've got together the leading Western powers and agreed not just a joint approach to dealing with the evacuation, but also a roadmap for the way in which we're going to engage with the Taliban. The number one condition that we're insisting upon is safe passage beyond the 31st, so beyond this initial phase for those who want to leave Afghanistan.
President Biden had been under pressure from allies, accused of setting an arbitrary date for pulling troops out. But the White House said tonight the deadline still stands.
We are currently on pace to finish by August 31st, but the president also asked the Pentagon and the State Department for contingency plans. We'll let them brief him on those before we give a further assessment.
And from EU leaders, acknowledgement that evacuations have to end once the Americans leave.
Naturally, I want to highlight the Americans are taking the lead on this. Without the Americans, neither we nor the others can continue the evacuations.
The British and others made no secret of the fact they wanted the president to extend his deadline. But with that possibility now gone, G7 leaders want to present a united front, whether that's supporting refugees or beefing up aid programmes. But the toughest decision they face is how to deal with the Taliban. Labour accused the Prime Minister of failing to come up with a long-term strategy.
He appears to have gone into the G7 as the chair of that most important group and come out without any clear plan for how they're going to work together to exert that pressure on the Taliban. And this is a really, really shameful moment for the United Kingdom.
Boris Johnson praised the airlift out of Afghanistan. This flight arrived in the UK this morning. In the coming months, we'll find out how much economic and political influence G7 countries can exert in the troubled region these families have left behind. Vicky Young, BBC News, Westminster.
North America editor John Sopel is at the White House for us now. John, the president has just started speaking. I expect we're not expecting his message to change.
Reeta, the extraordinary thing about it is I've been listening to the last 5 minutes and Joe Biden is on his feet in the Roosevelt Room just behind me now. And so far he's been talking about infrastructure in the US. He clearly wants to change the subject. But let's frame what happened at the G7. He had a plea from the French, he had a plea from the British, two of America's closest allies, for a delay on the 31st of August deadline, and the Taliban said no. And he's gone with the Taliban because the Taliban have the potential to cause a huge amount of trouble. One fascinating kind of thing that has unfolded over the past couple of days, we've now learnt that the CIA director flew to Kabul to meet the political director of the Taliban to discuss whether they could extend the deadline. So what's Joe Biden's calculation? I just think he wants to see Afghanistan off the screens, and the sooner America ends its operation, the better. The downside risk of that, of course, is that you don't get all the Americans and all the Afghan helpers out in that time. Undoubtedly, US service personnel, the British Armed Forces have done a phenomenal job in this evacuation. Joe Biden wants it to be seen as Dunkirk. Unfortunately for him, it still very much looks like the chaotic end of the Vietnam War and Saigon.
John, thank you. John Sopel reporting there. Well, the Taliban have taken back control of Afghanistan 20 years after being ousted from power by the US. And one of the big questions about the country's future is whether other international players will now move to try to fill the gap once US and other foreign forces leave. Our diplomatic correspondent Caroline Hawley has more.
Operation Enduring Freedom is what the Americans called it. At its height, there were more than 130,000 troops from more than 50 countries. Their fight against the Taliban brought freedoms for many Afghans that will not now endure. The West's presence in Afghanistan had already shrunk dramatically before the pullout that led to the Taliban takeover. The United States now only controls the airport with nearly 6,000 troops. It also runs the air traffic control for flights in and out of Kabul, while US fighter jets from a nearby aircraft carrier patrol the skies. Britain has more than 1,000 troops on the ground for one purpose only: to get people out. But the vast majority of Afghans have no ticket to the West. They can't leave and are now at the mercy of the Taliban. Today, the UN Human Rights Council held an emergency session. It's getting harrowing reports.
They include, among others, summary executions of civilians and all the combat members of the Afghan National Security Forces. Restrictions on the right of women, including the right to move around freely and girls' right to attend school. Recruitment of child soldiers and repression of peaceful protests and expression of dissent.
And how the Taliban now remake Afghanistan will have an impact way beyond its own borders. You only have to look at its geography to see why so many countries have a stake in what happens next. To the north, these former Soviet states have close ties to Russia. President Putin has voiced fears that terrorism could spill over from Afghanistan. To the west is Iran, where more Afghan refugees are already joining the 1 million already there. Pakistan in the past has been accused of providing shelter and support for the Taliban. And China, the superpower with its economic and security interests. It's China, along with Russia, who will now have influence in Afghanistan, not the West. Less than a month ago, Beijing was thinking ahead, hosting the Taliban, hoping to exploit new opportunities. China and Russia are happy to see the West's failure in Afghanistan. But with Afghan security forces now gone, what will happen to this terrain where Al-Qaeda once had training camps? The whole country is now a potential new home for Islamic extremism. And if that spills out of Afghanistan, it's a truly global threat. Caroline Hawley, BBC News.
Let's speak now to our Afghanistan correspondent, Secunder Kermani in Kabul. You were at the Taliban press conference, Secunder, earlier today. How do you interpret their comments about who is allowed to leave the country?
Well, one of the spokesmen telling me tonight that what they meant was that those Afghans who don't have the correct documentation, they won't be able to go to the airport, but others will. But that same spokesman also said in the press conference that the Taliban are not in favour of allowing Afghans to leave. So it really seems as if there's a degree of confusion here, and that's going to add to the fears of those who are trying to fly out. The Taliban clearly don't like the scenes that we're witnessing at the airport. It undermines the narrative that they want to portray, that they're bringing stability to the country. Now, at that press conference, the Taliban also talked about female government employees, saying they needed to stay at home for the moment because of the security situation. In the past, that justification has been used to keep women away from work permanently. Confusingly again, at one government office I visited in Kabul, female employees were being actively encouraged to return to work. All of this really adding to an atmosphere of deep anxiety and confusion here in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. Secunder Kermani there reporting from Kabul. Now, in other news, the latest government coronavirus figures show that there were 30,838 new infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period, which means on average there were 33,550 new cases per day in the last week. Yesterday, there were almost 7,000 people in hospital with the virus. 174 deaths were recorded in the past 24 hours, with an average of 101 deaths a day in the past week. On vaccinations, almost 88% of adults in the UK have now had their first jab, and just over 77% have had two. Scotland has recorded its highest ever number of daily cases, with the First Minister Nicola Sturgeon warning that she couldn't rule out the reintroduction of some COVID restrictions. Our Scotland correspondent Lorna Gordon reports.
One after the other, Scots are still being vaccinated. Told today it's making a big difference, but there's also a warning. Cases are on the rise again, concern is growing, and new controls are not off the table.
If the surge continues and if it accelerates and if we start to see evidence of a substantial increase in serious illness as a result, we cannot completely rule out having to reimpose some restrictions.
Half of Scotland's new COVID cases are in the under 25s, while around a third are people who've been double dosed. Numbers were predicted to go up, but this is being described as a fragile and pivotal moment.
We expected case numbers to rise. We expected to be a sharp rise when things like schools returned and testing increased. But there's an underlying trend upwards in case numbers in Scotland, and we've seen that for the past 2 to 3 weeks.
By law, you still have to wear masks here in Scotland in indoor public settings, such as shops or on public transport. But aside from that, most legal restrictions have now been lifted. And all of us, Nicola Sturgeon said, have been letting our behaviour drift back to normal. So if some restrictions were to return?
Restrictions coming back in would be quite tough, especially because we've just got back, especially nightlife wise, we've just got back to going to clubs and going to bars.
If the cases are rising and people are in danger, then I suppose it's going to be for the best.
A campaign group made up of families of those who died from COVID listened on as it was confirmed Scotland will hold a public inquiry into the crisis. This on a day when we have all been reminded that this pandemic is far from over. Lorna Gordon, BBC News, Glasgow.
Northern Ireland has also recently experienced record case numbers. Health officials are particularly concerned that not enough people under 40 have been vaccinated. A man whose 35-year-old wife died shortly after giving birth has made a plea for pregnant women to get a vaccine. Our Ireland correspondent Chris Page reports.
A wife, a mother, a care worker. The death of Samantha Willis has left a huge gap in many lives.
I love her, I miss her, we'll never forget her. She'll be in our hearts, and her main thing is they make her proud.
Samantha never got to hold her fourth child. Evie Grace was born 2 weeks ago when her mother was already in hospital seriously ill with COVID-19. Yesterday, Evie Grace was baptised during Samantha's funeral service.
I was standing at the graveside yesterday and I could just hear her tell me in my head, right, that's it, I'm gone, batter on, raise the wains, do what you have to do.
The COVID summer surge has been particularly strong in Northern Ireland. The case rate is currently 90 per 100,000 people. That's the highest of the UK's 4 nations by far. The death rate is also presently the worst in the UK, though it's 4 times lower than at the peak of the pandemic. Part of the reason for the alarming figures is that fewer people have come forward for a first vaccine dose than in England, Scotland or Wales.
We do see that vaccine uptake is lower in areas of greater social deprivation, and compared with the rest of the UK, Northern Ireland does have significantly more deprivation.
Thousands responded to a big appeal to get jabbed at the weekend. The largest vaccination centres are now being dismantled, but walk-in clinics are being set up to target specific areas with a low uptake. Vaccines have kept hospital admissions at a much lower level than in previous waves. Samantha Willis hadn't been vaccinated. Her widower wants to send out a message.
I think she would want to get pregnant people to get it. I just want to make her proud, and I think this is what she'll want, a story told, and if she can save one person or one family, then that's enough.
Josh Willis there, ending that report from Chris Page. Now, some of the world's biggest pop and rock stars have been paying tribute to the Rolling Stones drummer Charlie Watts, who's died at the age of 80. The musician had been a member of the band since 1963. David Silito looks back at his life.
I play the drums for Keith and Mick. I don't play for me.
Charlie Watts, cool, calm and distinctly dapper, the steady backbeat of the Rolling Stones. In a statement, the band said it was with immense sadness they were announcing the death of their beloved Charlie Watts. Among the tributes, Elton John, Ringo Starr, Paul McCartney.
Charlie was a rock and a fantastic drummer.
He was, though, always a reluctant rock star.
I can't play the drums at home, so I walk about with my hand. And to play the drums, I have to go on the road. And to go on the road, I have to leave home. It's like a terribly vicious circle that's always been my life.
A graphic designer by trade, he was not expecting his evening sideline with a little blues band called the Rolling Stones to make him famous.
We'd like to play a Bo Diddley number. I'm all right.
But for fellow drummer Kenny Jones from the Small Faces and The Who, he was a crucial part of the Stones' magic.
Charlie was a lovely, smart, amazing guy. Great. The reason he was such a great drummer is because he had a great feeling about himself and for others. The way he delivers the beat was absolutely spot on. I mean, he is the heart and soul of the Rolling Stones.
But his real passion was jazz. And rather than drugs and groupies, he liked antique silver and classic cars, even though he didn't drive. But even the sensible Stone had his moments. He knew he had a problem when the high priest of debauchery, Keith Richards, took him aside one day and gave him a talking to. Married for more than 50 years, he was always happiest at home with his dogs and horses. But his place in music history is on stage, keeping it together with the world's greatest rock and roll band.
The drummer Charlie Watts, who's died at the age of 80. McDonald's says it's run out of milkshakes and bottled drinks in all of its British restaurants due to problems with its supply chain. It's not the only company to be affected. Well, our business editor Simon Jack is with me. Simon, what's going wrong?
Yeah, this week it's McDonald's. Last week, you may remember, it was Nando's and KFC who are running short. The supply chain's cracks are beginning to appear. 3 reasons. Mainly a shortage of people, and particularly in transport, lorry drivers. 3 reasons. First of all, Brexit. We've lost 20,000 EU lorry drivers. Second, COVID. There's been a hiatus in testing new drivers, so we haven't been able to replenish their ranks. 3, age. Fewer younger drivers going into the profession because relatively it's getting paid less compared to other sectors over time. Add that all up and we are overstretched, but coping. People will have noticed small shortages. But in October, there'll be new checks on stuff coming in from the EU, and at the same time that may add to further delays. So listen, we are overstretched, we are coping, and because it's stretched, we will see localised pockets of shortages. This is just one example. Lorry drivers may end up getting paid more, but that may rise food prices for us all generally.
OK, Simon, many thanks. Police investigating the disappearance of Claudia Lawrence, who went missing in York more than 12 years ago, have revealed they're carrying out new searches just outside the city. The 35-year-old chef failed to arrive for work at York University on the 18th of March 2009. Danny Savage has the latest.
Claudia Lawrence, a 35-year-old chef who vanished in York 12.5 years ago. Police believe she was murdered, despite her body never being found. Today, in arguably the most significant development since she disappeared, police started searching woodland and flooded gravel pits in countryside 6.5 miles from where she was last seen alive.
I would like to stress that the searches that you will see in the coming days are just one of several active lines of inquiry which are currently being investigated and pursued by the North Yorkshire Police Major Investigation Team in our efforts to establish what happened to Claudia and to identify any person responsible for causing her harm.
Claudia disappeared from her home in York in March 2009. High-profile appeals were made at the time by the police and her father, who reported her missing.
This isn't a jaunt Claudia's gone on. She didn't take money, she didn't take a debit card, she didn't take a passport. As far as I'm aware, she didn't take spare clothes.
Police said the investigation had been difficult because Claudia didn't use social media or own a smartphone. Detectives won't be drawn on exactly what information brought them to this spot. Over the years, 9 people have been questioned over the disappearance of Claudia Lawrence. No one has ever been charged. But after all this time, this does feel significant. Her father campaigned relentlessly for information. But earlier this year, Peter Lawrence died. Now at last, there may be a breakthrough. Danny Savage, BBC News, at Sandhutton near York.
The 2020 Paralympic Games have officially opened in Tokyo just over 2 weeks after the Olympics ended. 4,000 athletes from more than 160 countries will take part in the Games. Andy Swiss reports.
364 days after it was meant to start, the countdown was finally complete. Despite the delay, despite the pandemic, the Paralympics arrived in a spectacle of sound and colour. A vibrant opening ceremony entitled We Have Wings, highlighting the power of Paralympians. But inevitably, there was also a more sombre note. At a time of record COVID rates here in Japan, the empty seats told their own story. Like the Olympics, these games will be largely behind closed doors. For the athletes, though, it's still the biggest stage of all.
And here they come.
The British team, led out by swimmer Ellie Simmons and archer John Stubbs, will have high hopes, while the parade also featured Afghanistan. Despite their team being unable to travel, their flag was carried by a volunteer as a symbol of solidarity. But for the competitors here, many of whom feared these games would never happen, the sense of joy was palpable. And the head of the Paralympics told them they'd already inspired the world at one of its most difficult times.
When the games were postponed last year, Paralympic athletes were beacons of hope. They never stopped believing they would be here in this stadium tonight. They are a force of nature. They are a force for good.
It was then left to Japan's Emperor Naruhito to declare the games officially open. An event which for so long looked in jeopardy is then at last reality, and the next 12 days of action could be just as spectacular. And so, after such a difficult build-up, finally these games are underway. And while for the organisers the challenge of COVID remains, they'll be hoping the athletes can now make the headlines. Andy Swiss, BBC News, Tokyo.
That's all from us. Have a very good night. Bye-bye.